In this lesson, we'll take a look at some of the materials in the scene and how they were made. First, I changed the ground so that there were some hills. I added some rocks as well. For the materials, I used Bridge, which is a very useful app for adding objects and materials. You can get it for free. It has a huge library of objects that were made using photogrammetry. You can go to the free section and download some objects and materials. You can install the plugin for Blender. So, when you select an object, you can choose the export settings, like choosing the textures you want. You can also choose the mesh's resolution. You can now open the settings for exporting. You can pick the target here. Blender in this case. Now, all you have to do is click the export button, and the object and its materials will be sent out of Blender. And this is what I did with these rocks. We also need to add the materials for the planet's surface and the ground. Getting back to Bridge, I chose this ice for the planet. I used a mix of 3 different materials for the ground. When we need to frame a large surface from a close-up angle and the surface is big, it helps to use more than one material. So, when seen from far away, we don't see a clear repeating pattern. Also, more details as we get closer to it. I won't go into a lot of detail about how to create materials in Blender. I'll just explain in general terms how I did it. First, export the material from Bridge. Now you have the new material in the materials list. We can see the final result in the shading pane. As I said, I exported 3 materials. These are the nodes we get from Bridge for each material. There is a normal map and a specular map. And the color map, of course. I want to mix these materials now. In order to do that, we have to make a mask that tells Blender how to mix 2 materials. By pressing Ctrl and Shift, and then clicking on a node, you can immediately see a preview of that node. But in order for this shortcut to work, you have to turn on the Node Wrangler add-in. So we can see a preview of this node, which is this single material. And this is the second material. I added this mask. It has a mushgrave texture. Then I added a mix shader node to mix the 2 materials. I connected the mask as a mixing factor. So, we have one material in the black areas, and another in the white areas of the mask. Lastly, I made a third texture. And in this case too, I mixed this texture with the materials we made before. Now, we can change how each material is distributed by simply changing each mask. Most of the time, it's helpful to make masks with a lot of contrast, so that we can see clearly where one material ends and another begins. By using a noise or mushgrave texture, we can also make irregular borders for a more natural and organic look. All of this is related to these simple materials. I also made sure that the spaceship lands on a flat surface. When it came to the hills, I just used the sculpt mode to make them. Let's show the original ground and enter sculpt mode. We have to turn on the Dyn Topo option of the brush for it to work correctly. It adds new faces to the areas where we are painting. If not, the process of sculpting would only be based on the real faces. And since we have a ground with a single face, nothing would happen. To raise or lower the ground, we can now just click the plus or minus button. Let's move on to the next simulation. Now we need to think about the small rocks and debris that fall to the ground as a result of the collision. However, before considering this simulation, I must return to the particles created by the impact with the building. If you remember, we gave the floors of the building the collision property. So, the particles could hit and bounce off them. But the particles could sometimes get stuck on the floor and keep moving and spinning. This is how the collision property of floors is set. We have set the permeability value to 0, which means that the particles can't go through the mesh. We also set the stickiness to 0, which means that the particles shouldn't stick to the floors. But, as we've already seen, this doesn't always work. To do this, the idea is to change the permeability value so that at first, the particles hit and bounced off the floor. But later, they are allowed to pass through the mesh, so that they don't get stuck on the floors of the building. But before you do this, make sure to delete the cache you make for the particle system. For instance, you can see that most of the properties are grayed out in this case. This means that the simulation is already done. So, you first have to delete the bake from each particle system. To show what I did, I started by setting the permeability value to 0. Now, I bake one of these particle systems again. And, as you can see, the particles stick to the floor and keep spinning in a strange way. So, as I said before, I'm going to change the permeability value a few frames after the impact. Let's bake it again by going back to the particle system. Now we get what we want. At first, the pieces hit the floor and bounced around. But soon after that, they go right through the floor and keep falling. Now we need to add the pieces of debris that were made by the impact. In this case, we'll also use a particle system to do that. The particles will be these small rocks. You could add this particle system to the ground directly. And make it work so that the particles come out when the spaceship hits the ground. But this is the wrong way to do it. We need to add the particle systems to the individual objects that hit the ground. Basically, the particles have to come from the surface of every object that touches the ground. This way, we can send the particles exactly where we want them to go, and give them the right direction and speed. So, I'll separate the surface of each object from which we'll send out the debris. This is the part that impacts the floor. Let's take a look at the spaceship's main body. Duplicate it. Now I have to keep just the surface next to the ground. Enter Edit mode, and then select the faces you want by pressing the C key. Now, flip the selection and then delete the selected faces. This gives us the surface that touches the ground. The particles will be released from this surface. Create a new particle system. The particles are released from the surface. But, of course, we need the particles to be released when the spaceship hits the ground. So, let's move to this frame and change the frame range of the emission. From this frame on, the particles are sent out. We gave the ground the collision property, so the particles stick to it. Under physical properties, permeability is set to 0 and stickiness is set to 1. But we want the particles to go in the same direction as the spaceship. We have many properties in the particle system. We can adjust the number of particles. And then there's lifetime. We need to make this number bigger, so that the particles will stay alive until the end of the animation. Another important setting is the way the particles are created. By default, they come from the faces of the surface. In the distribution pane, we can let the particles be created in a random way. The even distribution property should also be unchecked. Now scroll down to the speed section. Here is where we can give the particles speed and rotation. We want the particles to move in the same direction as the spaceship, as we've already said. With the object velocity option, we can do that. We've already talked about some of the other options for the speed of the building's particles. But object velocity lets us add a speed in the same direction as the emitter. Set this value to 1, for example, and the particles will move in this direction. By making this number bigger, the particles move faster, but always in the same direction as the emitter. At the same time, we could also increase the normal or tangent velocity to make the movement more chaotic. Consider also increasing the randomize value to make the particles move in a slightly different way. We also need to turn on the properties rotation and dynamic. This lets the particles turn and interact with other particles. This will be clearer when we add the rocks to the particle system. Lastly, we want the particles to stop moving after a while. One way to do this is to animate the object velocity property. It's important to adjust all of these properties by framing the scene with the final camera. So, from the right angle, we can see exactly how the particles move. When we set stickiness to 1 in the collision properties of the ground, the particles also stop moving after a while. Now we have to do the same things for all of the spaceship's parts. Don't forget to turn off the emitter's visibility as well. We don't want the emitter to be seen, since it was only made to emit particles. Now, we have to run the same simulation on all of the spaceship's surfaces that will hit the ground. So, we have to pick the right faces for each piece. For instance, these sides of this object. We have to do the same thing over and over for each surface. I'm also going to increase the angular velocity value to make the simulation powerful. It is also important to give the particles the right amount of mass. We can lower this value because we are dealing with debris. We also have to make particles come out of this cylinder, which is the main cabin of the spaceship. So, I'll make a copy and separate the outer faces. Notice that when you create the particle system, you don't have to give the object velocity property a positive value. In fact, in this case, we want the particles to move in the opposite direction. The next step is to create the particles we want. So we have to add simple objects like small rocks. But keep in mind that we need objects that are very simple and have as few faces as possible. In fact, they have to be duplicated thousands of times in the particle system, which has a big effect on performance. Let's add a simple cube. Go into edit mode and just move some points. A bevel modifier can also be added. In the final rendering, they'll be so small that you can't really tell what shape they have. Then we have to give these objects some different looks. Basically, we need to copy this object and change the shape of each copy slightly. So, we don't give all the particles the same exact mesh. This has to be done inside a new collection. So, you can choose this collection on the Render tab of the particle system. Also, check the box next to Pick Random. Now you have to use the scale option to change the size of the particles. As we've already said, turn off the property, Show Emitter. This is also how the particles are created. We can, of course, also add more particles and change other parameters. As usual, we have to deal with the simulation's cache in this situation as well. In the cache section, we can save the simulation to disk. Blender automatically makes a folder with the same name as the file in this case, as was already said. I recommend setting the compression settings to light. This can make files smaller. We have to repeat the full process for every particle system we make. Consider this simple trick to speed up the process. When we create a new particle system, Blender also creates a related particle setting configuration. All the properties we have set are here. So, when we make a new particle system, we can use the same particle settings to keep the same properties. This means we won't have to do it again. So, for this object, let's make a new particle system. Here, I can choose an already made setting. You can give each setting a unique name. When we choose it, the right properties are already set. Be aware that if you change these properties, you will change the settings for all particle systems that use these properties. To do a local override, you have to create a local copy by clicking here. You can now change some settings that are only used by this particle system. This is the final result. Each piece sends out particles. Also, the tail of the spaceship sends out some debris when it hits the ground. As was already said, the wheel sends particles in the opposite direction. It's important to know that the project files I uploaded don't have any cache attached to them. In fact, the cache is sometimes a very large file that takes up a lot of gigabytes. So it would be impossible to upload on the platform. This means that if you want to download some of these files, you will have to create the cache on your PC by hand.